Hello and welcome to Roadmap 2023, our election issues and personalities tracking program. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. Thanks for joining us today. My guest on this edition believes that awareness creation about the new rules guiding elections will, to a large extent, determine how well turnout and results are viewed. My guest also believes continuous security challenges, particularly attacks on INEC's facilities, will, if not addressed, impact the conduct of the 2023 general election. Roadmap 2023 talks to the co-founder and executive director of Yaga Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo. Samson Itodo, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Always a delight and compliments of the season.
Same here, same to you. Let me begin from the issue of younger candidates. Your organization championed the Not Too Young to Run Act, but that was ahead of the 2019 election, and many people had looked forward to the fact that, well, okay, the space between the passage of the law and the 2019 election was too short for the law to have an immediate impact, but that in the run-up to 2023, that impact would be better felt. But from all indications, that has not exactly proved to be the case. Are you disappointed, perhaps, or is it early days and too soon to reach such conclusions?
Well, thanks. I am not in any way disappointed. Although it leaves so much to be desired, the level of youth candidacy across the country. But in 2019, 20 young people between 25 and 29 won election into their state houses of assembly. And these folks who won the election couldn't have contested in 2019 election if the constitutional requirement for the age qualification for State House of Assembly wasn't reviewed from 25 to 30. And so in terms of immediate impact, this is a clear evidence that, yes, there were people who ran and there are people who won their elections. And these 20 of them, we've kept tabs with them and have been monitoring their performance in office. And I would say that we are impressed with over 80% of these young people who are primary beneficiaries of the Not Too Young to Run. But the point about scale is where we have an issue, that the level of youth representation in public office still stands at 6%. And that is abysmally low, and it needs to be increased. But if you look at the 2023 elections, whilst the youth candidacy for 2019 elections was at 34%, the Yaga Africa Youth Candidacy Report for 2023 clearly shows that there was a decline in the level of youth candidacy from 34% to 28%. And that is disturbing. And there are several reasons responsible for that. First is the point about the cost of politics. In 2023, the political parties increased high cost of nomination forms. The second was the unlawful, and perhaps call it the illegal, substitution of candidates after the party primaries. And thirdly, is the lack of internal democracy within the political parties. And so these are some of the factors that account for this decline on the level of youth candidacy, despite the enthusiasm that young people have expressed to participate in the political process.
Given that, that's on one hand, you have the youth as candidates, but now let's take a look at them as voters. There's been a great deal of voter apathy, particularly among the young and the youth in the preceding election seasons that we have had. But it does look as if perhaps this time the story may be a bit different, at least by the pictures and the visuals and the videos that we see about rallies and about people actively engaging in discussions and the issues and all of that. Does the data bear this out in terms of what you are seeing as numbers of those who, for example, maybe have registered to collect their voters' cards and are getting actively involved in the electoral process itself, even if they are not candidates?
Larry, if there's one thing that gives me hope and gives me joy, it's the level of enthusiasm on the part of young people to participate in the political process. Despite the poor state of the economy, despite the polarization within the Nigerian polity, despite the failure of governance to provide for the welfare and the security of Nigerians, despite the fact that justice is for a microscopic few, those who can afford it, and not for the vast majority of our people, we see young people show up to register to vote. We see young people determined to collect their PVCs. We see young people asking government and their political leaders difficult questions. That gives me a lot of hope. And the level of turnout for the voter registration, including those who are now showing up to collect their PVCs, makes a bold statement that young people and citizens in general have not lost faith in this country. They've not lost faith in democracy. They've not lost faith in our electoral process.
Your optimism has been shared by quite a lot of people, but then that takes me to the next point, which is that if they are willing, if they want to participate, then we now have to take a look at what would either aid that participation or hinder it. And that brings me to the issue of security. Even in the run-up to this interview, there was yet another attack on INEC's facility, an INEC facility in Imo State, I believe it is. And one is wondering, the INEC chairman, Professor Mahmood Yakubu, had said that between the last election cycle and now, there have been over 50 attacks on its facilities in more than 15 states. So this is not a coincidence. This is not just happenstance. There seems to be something at play here. But in terms of aiding participation, many people will stay off. I mean, if they don't think that the voting environment is going to be safe. So do you harbor fears? And if so, what can be done by the authorities at this point to address those fears and secure those facilities to ensure that all what you've talked about so far about young people's interest and young people's participation, both as candidates and as voters, can come to a logical conclusion?
Well, like you said, it will be foolhardy for anyone to not be concerned with the current state of the environment building to the elections. Like you noted, and what data actually says, and this is official data released by INEC, that between 2019 and 2022, there have been 51 attacks, and this include the attack on INEC office in Imo. So there are 51 attacks still in 15 states of the Federation. This is disturbing on different fronts. One, the implication of this actually borders on the whole notion of political participation and whether citizens are going to be given the opportunity, to exercise a constitutional right that is very dear to them. Because we can't deprive the Nigerian people in those states the opportunity to select leaders of their choice. And so this attempt, like you said, and INEC quite noted in several reports that it is systematic. And you can clearly see that there's just an attempt to ensure election does not hold in those contexts. Now, there are three implications for this. The first one is that this destruction of INEC facilities will mean that the commission will have to rebuild those facilities. And the big question is, does INEC have sufficient time to rebuild some of those facilities that are destroyed, or it needs to make some interim arrangements to enable the INEC conducts its activities? The second is this destruction and attacks target sensitive materials, because for us, the PVC is a sensitive material, because without the PVC, no one can cast their vote at elections. So when you destroy the PVCs in INEC's offices, you deprive those people the opportunity to cast their vote. And INEC has to reprint those permanent voters' cards. and ensure they deliver them, or the owners come to collect their PVCs in good time before the elections. The third part is we are going to be wasting taxpayers' money, because taxpayers' monies will be expended in rebuilding these facilities, in producing those PVCs. As we speak, INEC has already indicated that its budget for the election is already overstretched due to inflation and other incidental responsibilities that the commission needs to handle. And so the more we have these attacks, the more we have this destruction, the more we are spending money, and the cost of our elections is rising. And so this is disturbing, because in those locations, the issue around the legitimacy of the outcome of elections that come from those places will definitely be called to question. And our urge and our call, to the security agencies, we're glad that we've heard about reports of some of the suspects who are behind these incessant attacks. We hope that they will be prosecuted diligently, and this should serve as a deterrence, to any actor, anyone who is determined to subvert the process by preventing either INEC from conducting elections or preventing voters from exercising a constitutional right vested in them by virtue of their being citizens of this country.
I want to press you a bit further on that point, but from another angle, in the sense that when we're talking about this issue of security, voter turnout, and the legitimacy of the elections, I believe one of my guests on this program a few weeks back had pointed to the fact that in the case of the Anambra governorship election, the election took place in spite of all the various security concerns and so on. But the voter turnout was extremely low. Less than 10% of those who were registered to vote voted. And so it put a question mark on those who emerged from that process, because could we really say that they represented the full will of the people as expressed at the ballot box? Now, that was in the case of Anambra. If you bring that to the national level, you and I are familiar with the security challenges outside of INEC's facilities in various parts of the country, which are already putting question marks on the ability or inability of people to vote. So the broader question is, do we have a situation where we could have a legitimacy issue with the elections, more broadly speaking, given our larger security situation?
Absolutely. We would have legitimacy questions in the next election if this issue is unaddressed. And beyond that, you could also have several litigations that will question whether the credibility of the elections from those places, as well as the credibility of the outcomes. Because first, let's look at this issue. There are some locations that we know, INEC may not be able to conduct election in those places. The first thing is to consider what the Constitution actually says about the threshold for the determination of a winner in a presidential election. And the Constitution is clear that elections, has to hold in all the states, and for governorship elections in all the local governments. Now, if these issues are not addressed, at this point about security, first, INEC will be unable to deploy to those locations. And if INEC is unable to deploy in those locations, INEC cannot make a return, especially if the total number of people who collected their PVCs in locations where elections did not hold exceeds the margin of lead between the two leading candidates in the election. And so the margin of lead principle we apply. And in those circumstances, especially where INEC or the security agencies do not tell Nigerians and the public where these locations are, where these communities are, it creates room for suspicion and distrust. Because we've seen cases where elections do not hold in certain places, but results, emanate from those places. And these are the kinds of things that we must prevent in this pre-election period, where there has to be a high level of transparency from INEC, from the security agencies, including stakeholders who are involved in this particular, who work on elections. Because the Electoral Act is very clear as to postponement of elections in the case of emergency. And what the law says is that if before the date of election, there's the reason to believe that there will be likely breach of peace in those locations. INEC can postpone elections to a later date, but there's a condition for the postponement of elections in those locations. And the first is that the reason must be cogent and the reason must be verifiable. That places a lot of burden on INEC to be transparent and share information about locations where it is unable to deploy. And then we need to look at the legal implications for those for election not holding in those locations. And these are conversations that I hope that we are having at this moment, or should have, in the build-up to the election, so that the public and stakeholders will be sufficiently aware. So there is no need, to cast doubts on the minds of Nigerians that there's something sinister, or this concern that stakeholders have that the security situation may be exploited, to manipulate the election.
The 2022 Electoral Act is like the omnibus document now outside provisions of the Constitution that are guiding of elections and the electoral process. So many people have talked about the fact that, in some instances, it is a vast improvement from what we had before. It has closed some of the legal and other loopholes as part of the processes. It has introduced or legalized the introduction of technology into the election process. It has provided for INEC's funding and the monitoring of parties and contestants' funding and limits on that funding. What do you make of the Electoral Act itself, particularly because there are those who argue that, well, yes, there were those benefits, but then it still also left a lot of loopholes to exploit?
Laddie, there's no perfect piece of legislation anywhere in the world because societies are dynamic, societies are not static, and what laws do is that they respond to either the prevailing circumstances in the society, but also try to visualize what the future would look like and provide mechanisms for managing those situations. Having said that, the 2022 Electoral Act is an improvement and perhaps one of the best electoral legal framework that the country has had since our return to democracy. It has provisions that, reflect the will of the Nigerian people, but also provisions that strengthen our democratic institutions and improve the transparency of the electoral process. So to that extent, I would say that this current act that we have can deliver, credible elections if and only if the actors play by the rules and they comply with the provisions of the act. If you look at several provisions of the act, and let's take, two key provisions. We've talked about electronic transmission of results. We've talked about the BVAS. The current act legalizes the use of any technological device, and in this case, the BVAS, for electronic accreditation. This same act also provides for electronic transmission of results. And let's not forget that it took struggle and public and citizens' engagement before the National Assembly and even the President assented to this legislation. And we hope that it will deliver credible polls, but there are certain gaps within the legal framework. The one you've talked about is this point about even political financing. And one of the things that we are seeing from operationalizing this act is that in the post-2023 era, we need a comprehensive reform to political financing, and in this case, funding of political parties, as well as all campaign spending limits. You've seen cases where there's this obscene commercialization of the candidate nomination process, this whole delegate system. We've also seen, some impracticability in the sort of campaign finance limits imposed in the Electoral Act, or even this attempt, to give INEC power with the right hand and then take it with the left hand, because the Act says INEC shall issue regulations or stipulate limits for contribution either to a candidate or to a party. But the Act also goes in other section to set the limit and says, 50 million, set a 50 million threshold, but also go ahead to say that you can actually contribute more than 50 million to a candidate or a party, provided the party can demonstrate or show the source, of the funding or support that or contribution that it receives. And so there are several provisions. There are also complexities, in the current electoral act. And one of the things that we celebrate the most is this whole provision in the act where it confers, superiority on the results transmitted electronically using the BVAS. And if you check section 60 and section 64, where it talks about the procedure for the verification and confirmation of results by a collation officer or returning officer before results are declared, that both results transmitted electronically and results also collated manually, that you have to verify. And where there is a conflict between the results transmitted electronically and the one in the hard copy results sheets, the one transmitted electronically using the BVAS and published on the IREV will take precedence over that which over the hard copy result sheets. We believe that if this is implemented to the latter, and citizens also provide vigilance over this process, and this is why we urge citizens that the only way to stop election rigging and manipulation is vigilance, staying at the polling unit after you vote, ensuring that the presiding officers use the BVAS to take the original result sheet, the Form EC8A for that polling unit, ensure that they take the image and you see it and it's the authentic result before it is uploaded on the portal. These are the kinds of things that citizens, have a role to play, their role in ensuring that the election is credible.
The other thing, of course, is that while the electoral body and even perhaps the lawmakers were trying to put in place a framework to guarantee free and fair elections, the politicians had moved a step further. And since it is now not possible, or it is extremely difficult to rig elections by snatching away ballot boxes, you've talked about the BVAS and all the technology that has been introduced, they have resorted to the more simple form of simply hanging around the polling booths and actually physically buying off the voter who is then, induced to go and vote. And we have seen this in the more recent elections. And some of the people that I've spoken to have pointed at the configuration of the polling booth to indicate that it's possible for someone to go and vote and then come and show the paymaster that he has voted in the direction guided, and then, go and put his ballot in the box and then come and collect his due thereafter. But then INEC's retort is that the voting system in Nigeria is open secret. You thumbprint in private, but you've got to drop it into the box in the full glare of everyone. And that at that point, that's where this shenanigan can possibly happen. So at the end of the day, how do we get around that?
Well, a few days ago, INEC had a meeting around vote buying, as well as illicit financial flows into our electoral process. I think what is very clear is that, like you noted, politicians have resorted to compromising the choice of voters and by buying voters on the day of elections. And that, again, is a big threat to the credibility of elections. Because at the end of the day, what you see is it outcomes or purchased turnout or purchased result. Because when you buy those votes, the outcome of that election cannot stand the test of credibility or integrity. And it's not a reflection, of the free choice of people who come to vote at elections. And so anyone who emerges out of an election where votes were bought cannot lay claim to any form of legitimacy. The second critical point is about prosecution. Now, we've seen cases where the anti-corruption agencies, have arrested people. There has been some droplets of prosecution. We don't know what's the outcome of those prosecution. But quite frankly, Ladi, until politicians who sponsor mercenaries to buy votes are brought to book, they are sanctioned and banned from public office, you're still going to have, politicians going to elections with one agenda to weaponize poverty and buy votes from people. The third point about the configuration of the polling unit. Yes, INEC has reconfigured the polling units. New polling units were created. And one of the considerations in the creation of this polling unit is to structure polling units in a way that it protects the sanctity and the secure and the sanctity of the secrecy of the vote. But that has not delivered, high outcomes. We still see people, undermine the process, party agents disrupting and interfering with the process in a way that they still monitor how voters cast their ballot so they get the reward at the end of the day. And so, yes, you can configure and reconfigure polling units. But the last point is, how do you make it difficult for liquidity or raw cash to be in the hands of politicians, building up to the elections? And so even at civil society, we're very happy and excited with the limits imposed by the central bank in the initial days. But this current attempt, which to a large extent, the CBN has yielded to this pressure of increasing the limits. One of the adverse effects of this sort of review to the limits will make politicians, or will provide access to the capital for politicians to use on election day to buy votes. And it's actually disturbing, this sort of amount of pressure that has led the CBN to review the thresholds for withdrawals or cash withdrawals in this case. So we had thought that this was a good policy that would limit access to cash that politicians will have to buy votes on election day. But be that as it may, I think that, one, in the immediate term, our anti-corruption agencies will need to work closely with INEC, and we're excited with this level of collaboration. But with Nigerians want to see prosecution on one hand, see arrest, particularly not of the mercenaries, but also of the politicians who deploy those resources and sponsor those people to buy votes. On the part of the voter, I think it's important that Nigerians also know that when you sell your vote, you lose your voice. And you've got to think about the future, because that 5,000, 2,000, 1,000 cannot deliver the kind of governance that you require in a sustainable manner. Just think about your children. There's a reason why these politicians are buying your votes, because they know your vote is powerful. If it weren't powerful, they wouldn't go to the extent of buying your vote. So please, choose leaders based on their track record, based on those who have the capacity to address the problems that affect you, and not yield to this pressure and this temptation to collect 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, or 10,000 that you will spend within a few hours and then live in regrets for the next 4 years.
We have talked about some of the game changers, if you want to call them that, in the process already. We talked about the beavers. We talked about the fact that you can't vote if you don't have a PVC. There's no question of incident form, which used to be one of the things that that proved to be an abuse of the process in previous elections. But one of the things that could really prove to be helpful in terms of citizens or voters keeping an eye on the process was that which INEC brought to bear, but which your organization, working with ours, used to great effect in the Ekiti elections, and then, of course, subsequently, and which we want to use and we hope to use for the coming elections. And that is this results viewing portal, where results are uploaded real time, and it's possible to actually see what is going on from a wide spectrum of election points on election day, even though you are not in INEC. You are not having access to the INEC server. Is it really that much of a game changer as we all, see it to be? Or is it something that is also quite possible that what people commonly refer to as the Nigerian factor can infiltrate?
Well, is it a game changer? The answer is in the affirmative, and a strong yes. it's a game changer. One of the remarkable innovations introduced in our electoral process is this IREV, the INEC Election Results Viewing Portal. And that portal gives citizens and members of the public access to polling unit level results. Polling unit level results. And so once elections have been concluded at the polling unit, the presiding officers, the INEC officials record the results. They put the results out there online, and any Nigerian from any part of the world can have access, to the result. What it does is it serves as a check at the collation level. You recall that the ward level collation is the weakest link. Results collation is the weakest link in our electoral process. That is where they manipulate and rig the elections. But now they can't do it because by 2:33 p.m., all the results are already up on the portal, and Nigerians can view them. Transparency in the results management process limits election manipulation. It limits election rigging. This is why politicians don't like the IREF, and they don't like, quite frankly, some politicians don't like the IREF as well as the BVAS because it limits election manipulation. It limits rigging. And for those of them who are determined to rig the process, this serves as a check. So this is one game changer that we celebrate. And based on the protocol, there are two criteria that you must fulfill, to get to use the INEC election results viewing portal. One, you need to have an email address, and two, you need internet or data to access the portal because it's a web portal. And so Channels TV and Yiga Africa sat down and said, wait, how do we take this to the rooms and the living rooms and the bedrooms of Nigerians? Because the greater, the more, the merrier. And we discovered, both Channels and Yiga Africa, that it's not every Nigerian that has an email address. Not every Nigerian has access to internet data. But most Nigerians, have access to their televisions and they can watch this. And this is why the election results analysis dashboard, a very unique, innovative tool, was designed. It was deployed in Ekiti and it was deployed in Osun. And from 4 p.m. on election day, once we download the results from the INEC portal, Channels TV takes this to the homes of Nigerians, and Nigerians follow this process. And I tell you, when we experimented in Ekiti and Osun, it was quite remarkable and how citizens followed the process on television, and it just enhanced the quality of as well as the dynamism and the excitement that comes with elections, because citizens were following the results. And it also serves as a check. So anyone who wants to manipulate the collation process will not have any need to do so anymore because the result is out there in the public. And so this effort will also be used in the 2023 elections. And we are preparing, ensuring that all the lessons that we've learned from Ekiti and Osun, we will employ them in the next deployment. And what did we see? And why we say this is a game changer. If you look at the frequency of the uploads of the results, both from Ekiti and Osun, they were quite timely, and those platforms were accessible to anyone who accessed the portal. But through our innovation on Yiga Africa and Channels, we also identified a lapse on the part of the INEC portal, where in Osun, for instance, there was a delay in signing up or creating accounts on the portal because of either the traffic on the portal. We've tendered or submitted 10 recommendations, to INEC following Ekiti and Osun. We're excited that some of those recommendations are being implemented, and we're looking forward to a new outlook of the INEC election results viewing portal. But we want to assure Nigerians that what you saw in Ekiti and Osun, it would also come your way, it will come to your screen for the general elections, where elections will be holding in 176,846 polling units. And rest assured that both Yiga Africa and Channels TV will bring every result from every polling unit down to your doorstep.
Indeed, we shall. So our Nigerians can look forward to that. But then that brings up the issue about the role of organizations like yours and ours in this process. The whole idea is that, I mean, INEC is the election management body, but it really cannot do this by itself. And so people raise the issue of participation by other bodies in INEC's process of managing the electoral process itself. How much of a role do you think INEC has allowed for such organizations, CSOs and others like that, to play in the process of molding the electoral process, identifying where challenges are, modifying those challenges to look after them, and then taking along all these stakeholders in the process? How much of a role do you think INEC has allowed these other important bodies to have?
No, quite frankly, having worked on elections in the last 16 years, I would say we have an improved electoral commission compared to during the era of Maurice Iwu. It was quite difficult working with the electoral commission. We've also seen a more transparent commission. We've seen a commission that is also interested in learning from civil society organizations and other stakeholders. We've also seen a commission that is interested and is intentional about engaging stakeholders. We've also seen a commission, to a large extent, who accepts recommendations from civil society organizations, from media. And that is how an electoral commission should operate. Whilst we note that there are several gaps that exist, but this current commission is quite an improved commission. But we have our concerns. And this is why in the next couple of days, civil society groups will release an election manipulation risk index that highlights several variables being used to manipulate elections by different stakeholders as a way of keeping oversight on this process. And I think that what INEC has done, and particularly now, if you look at the aspect about information sharing, the commission, this particular commission, has sort of improved with releasing information. You can see that the public has and stakeholders have information and access to election data relating to the voter register, relating to PVC, also relating to list of candidates. INEC has sort of reviewed its communication. It's also issuing statements on a periodic basis to provide clarity on some of its actions or debunk fake news, but it's also ensured that quarterly it meets with stakeholders and these meetings, evolve with recommendations. So to that extent, INEC has really improved in sharing information with stakeholders. Secondly, I think the strategic partnership that INEC also has with other stakeholders in the process has really contributed to improving the professional competencies of INEC, but also strengthening the independence of the commission. So you look at issues like the IREV and the access that members of the public have. This innovation enjoys the support of stakeholders. But before these innovations, are released even to members of the public, stakeholders are invited to make inputs into INEC's policy, into the guidelines for elections, into some of those framework that INEC has released. And stakeholders who work on elections are part of this process. They are consulted most times before these policies are issued. So quite frankly, I think INEC is playing that role around stakeholder engagement. We've also seen where the commission has opened up itself for training by different stakeholders, whether by international organizations or by civil society organizations. I know specific organizations are supporting the commission with things like election logistics, with things like results management, things like electoral technology, things like voter education, which is one domain of partnership between both INEC and other stakeholders, things like mobilization, for the voter registration. If you recall, a few months ago, both INEC, YIGA Africa, and the EU delegation did host concerts across the country, the Youth Vote Count concert, to mobilize people to certain locations where INEC was conducting voter registration. And I know in TBS Square in Lagos, INEC registered at those concert venues over 17,000 people. In the old parade ground in Abuja, INEC also registered over 25,000 people. So that level of partnership and openness on the commission is quite commendable. But of course, there are other concerns relating to things like political interference with INEC. There are external interference with the work of INEC. There's several pressure on INEC to undermine the process, but the commission is resisting, and Nigerians, when the commission takes action that advance public interest and the integrity of the process, we have a duty to protect the independence of the commission. But where the commission takes action that are either inconsistent with the values of electoral integrity, we all have a duty to continue to hold INEC to greater standards, because a better and an improved and independent INEC is what Nigerians desire. And that is a commission that can deliver credible elections in 2023.
I cannot do this kind of interview with you and not ask you about election day itself. All the preparations, all what we have discussed so far can aid preparations. But on election day itself, as we have discovered over the election circles, even if we limit it to this republic starting from 1999, is that traditionally voters are left waiting at polling stations for INEC officials, and then sometimes the INEC officials arrive and then the materials have not arrived, so they're also still waiting themselves, and then sometimes security is left behind, and then they also have to wait for those as well, and all of that. Do you think that things are being done differently this time in such a way that, even if we are to witness things like that, first, the delay will not be at the pace that it sometimes was in the past, and will not be as widespread? Because some of the reports that organizations like yours produced, even from Ekiti and Osun and Anambra and so on, still indicated that we still had significant challenges on election day with movement of materials and personnel.
Well, Nigerians should know that we are already monitoring the process and also monitoring INEC's preparations. And we released our pre-election observation reports because YIGA Africa has 877 observers spread across the 774 local governments of the country. We do have people in those local governments tracking the preparations for the elections. And with respect to preparations for the elections, at least in over 90% of local governments, we can confirm that INEC is conducting preparatory activities. And those activities include collection of PVCs, training of election officials, as well as voter education. We can confirm that even in local governments that witness flooding, we've seen a resilient INEC who has moved beyond the flooding, created other avenues where it's conducting its activities. So INEC, we can say that at least in over 90% of local governments across the country, INEC is deploying or INEC is preparing. We've also seen reports where BVAS machines have been deployed to a couple of states. We've seen pictures online and also in stakeholder meetings. INEC has said it's deployed the BVAS in over 25 to 30 states. For the non-sensitive materials, we also know that INEC has deployed those sensitive materials and they are stored in several locations which are undisclosed for the purposes of security. The other issue is the sensitive materials. And in this case, based on what INEC has told stakeholders, that for the 2023 elections, we don't expect a postponement like we saw in the 2019 elections, because most of the materials are being produced right here in Nigeria, unlike in 2019, where they were produced outside the country. But on election day, 24 hours before election day, or let's even say the week of elections, those materials, sensitive materials, and in this case, the BVAS is now a sensitive material, the ballot paper and the result sheets will be deployed, from the state offices of INEC to the local governments, and 24 hours, that Friday, and in this case for the first election on the 24th of February, all the racks And these racks are registration area centers where the materials will be stored closer to the polling units. We expect that by 7 a.m. on election day, INEC would have deployed its staff to those polling units for voting to start at 8 o'clock or 8:30. But there are several issues that could prevent that. One, if security agencies do not deploy security to INEC at a location where INEC requests, it will be difficult for INEC to deploy. Because what we saw in previous elections is the security agencies, instead of deploying their personnel to the local government office or the racks where the materials are kept, they deploy straight to the polling units. And then they leave the polling officials and the materials stranded at the wards, because the rule is you cannot deploy from the wards to the polling unit without security. So I hope that the Interagency Committee on Election Security and INEC are trying to close this loose end and provide clarity on what will be the movement and deployment for materials. The second issue about election day is also the functionality of the beavers. And this is where, voters also have a role to play, because the guidelines is very clear that if first you need to show up with a PVC. We've heard people say, oh, you can vote without your PVC. Please, fellow Nigerians, the law is clear, the guidelines is clear. Without a PVC, you cannot vote. Do not subscribe or buy this misinformation out there. INEC has said no PVC, no voting, no accreditation, no voting, and you need the PVCs to be accredited. When you show up on election day, the presiding officer must try 3 times to accredit you. And if after 3 times of the trial, you are not accredited and your name is not on the register for that polling unit, you cannot vote on election day. So note, the guideline says the polling officer will have to try to accredit you 3 times. But the other part is, in the event a beavers malfunctions, and the guidelines is clear, if there's sustained malfunction. So if the beavers does not come on, if the beavers does not accredit anyone on the polling units, please ensure that a replacement beavers is provided, because INEC said a replacement beavers will be provided between the time of that sustained malfunctions to 2:30 p.m. There will be no manual accreditation. So if beavers malfunctions, please wait until INEC deploys a new beavers to that polling unit. If by 2:30 p.m. on election day, the beavers is not provided, that election for that polling unit will hold the next day, or the election for that particular location will be cancelled. So please, this is the information members of the public should be aware of, that where there might be a logistical challenge, there is a remedy. And if that remedy is not provided, there is also the position of the law on how situations will be managed. So don't take to the streets, don't incite violence because there is some logistical issue. There are already mechanisms in the guidelines as well as our law for taking care of any logistical issue on the day of election.
Very, very important information as you've provided. Samson Itodo, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure my viewers have learned a lot too within this discussion. Thank you for your time on the program today.
No, thanks, always a delight, and compliments of the season, and Happy New Year.
Same to you. Same to you. Thank you. That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I'm Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.